All right, so what I'm going to do now is, we've talked about these two functions in great detail. So we've talked about the approve function, which is like signing the check. And we've talked about the transfer function, which is basically encashing the check. So I essentially allow somebody to transact on my behalf, or I essentially allow somebody that they can go and withdraw money from my account. So like I sign the check and I give it to somebody, and that somebody is now allowed to go and take the money out from my bank account and do whatever they want to do with it, transfer it to somebody else, whatever they want to do with it. All right, so for that, like we discussed, we're going to use the approve function and the transfer of function. And let's look at the approve function. So if I simply go over here, I've got the approve function, and my approve function takes two arguments. One is the spender and one is the amount. So approve function is like signing a check. So remember this analogy, it will really help you understanding the concept. So what I'm doing is, now that I am from the founder's address, so I will simply select the founder's address, 0x5b3, and this is the address of the founder. So the founder's address, right? And from this address, what I'm going to do is I'm going to allow somebody 50 tokens. So this is my from address, and I'm going to select any other address on random. So let me take the second one. It's 0xab8, and I will copy the link of this. And to this address, I'm now going to approve that this address can take 50 tokens or transact 50 tokens on my behalf. Now, I'm just giving a check at the moment. So approve function is like I'm allowing somebody to go and withdraw 50 tokens, right? I have not yet given the 50 tokens. The approve function only is like signing a check. What it's going to do is that it's simply going to put this in the allow list. So the message.sender is the founder, and the spender is this address that I have passed over here, and it will allow it this amount. So if you translate this statement, what it's going to do is, I'm just going to decode the statement a bit. So what it will do is, this is how it's going to be decoded. So it will say allowed, and inside allowed, it's going to say message.sender, which is the address of the founder, and then in the next there would be the address of the spender. So Control C, and I'll paste it over here, and this is the address of the spender, and this spender I'm allowing to play with 50 tokens on my behalf. So that's how this statement is going to translate into. All right, so I'm going to remove this as I'm not intending to compile the plan program with this. It will throw an error. So I'll simply just remove this. All right, so what I'm doing is, once again, one last time, that from the founder's address, I'm allowing somebody to transact 50 tokens, basically signing a check, and I will simply hit transact. All right, so I get very interesting error, and that says revert, the transaction has been reverted to an initial state, and the reason provided by the contract, balance of the approver should be greater than 0. So it basically stops at this, and it says balance of approver should be greater than 0. So what do you think is the problem over here? Did you think of what the error would be? So it basically says that the transaction has been reverted to the initial state. Reason provided by the contract, the balance of the approver should be greater than 0. So it essentially stopped at this require statement, and everything was rolled back because the message.sender address has an amount which is less than 50, which we are trying to transact. So let's see what is the from address. If I scroll up, I can very clearly see my mistake over here, that this should have been the founder's address. This account has no balance. If I copy this and if I check the balance of this account, it has no balance. And something that has no balance, how can you transfer from that account or write a check, right? So this account has a balance of 0. So I can't essentially even write a check. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make the correction over here. So this should be the founder's address, which is 0x5b3. And inside the approve function, now I have the correct recipient address, whom I'm not sending 50 tokens, I'm just signing a check for 50 tokens. And now I will hit transact. And you see, the moment you hit transact, the transaction successfully got passed. If I check the balance of this one, it should return me 0. Because remember, the approve function has not transacted 50 tokens into this account. It has only allowed that this person can spend 50 tokens. So it has not actually transferred 50 tokens. Remember that. This is important to understand. All right, so if I want to now check how much is this address allowed to spend on the owner's behalf. So I'm going to copy the address of the owner over here. So let's just copy the address of the owner over here. So copy this address and I will paste it inside the allowance function. And let's just copy the address of this new recipient where I transfer 50 tokens over here. And let's just call it. And you see, it basically tells you that this particular owner, which happens to be the founder of the smart contract, has allowed this particular spender to spend 50 tokens on his behalf. So this owner has given a check to this spender of 50 tokens. And this is exactly what the allowance function returns us. It returns us the mapping, the allowed mapping, that how much has somebody allowed somebody else to spend on their behalf, or how much has somebody given a check to somebody so that they can encash it. So this is how the allowance function works. Now, what happens if I check the allowance of some other random address? So I'll check if the owner has given allowance to another random address. And since we've just given allowance to any one function, it should obviously return a 0. So I'm going to copy any other random address and I'm going to paste it over here and I'll hit call button and you can see it returns a 0. So we've just allowed one particular address to spend on behalf of the owner, and that is this address. So I'm going to copy this over here just so we remember that this address has been allowed to spend 50 tokens on behalf of the owner. All right, so now I've got the check. I want to encash it as well, right? So I'm not going to keep the check. I want to encash it as well. So let's now call the transfer from function. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to use these 50 tokens that have been just passed to me. So this is the address that was just allowed 50 tokens. All right, so looking at this, that we have made the allowance of on behalf of the owner to a spender for 50 tokens. And now what we are going to do is we're going to call the transfer from function. So now we are going to do the actual transfer of tokens from this address to this address, because this is where we had signed the check. So if you recall that when we were looking at the approve function, this is where we had signed the check. We had given an approval to this account from the owner's from address that this account can transact, this account is allowed $50 tokens. But now what we are going to do is we are going to actually make the transfer of those 50 tokens. So I'm going to put my founder's address over here, so 0x5b3, and I'm just going to verify this, so 0x5b3 and DDC4, so I'll just check the last 4 digits. And then the recipient address is now this one. So let's just pick up another random recipient, and this could be any address, so that's available in this list, but I have picked up this address, which is 0x583. And what I'm going to do is that I'm saying basically now transfer from, the actual tokens are being transferred in this transfer from function. Earlier we had just created the allowance and the approval. And now I'm basically transferring from the sender to this actual recipient. So I'll just double confirm and paste this over here. And this is the address of the recipient, 0x583, and this is different from that of the founder. And I'm sending this all the 50 tokens. So I'll just say 50 and I'll hit transact. Now I get an error, so I'll just simply check what is my from address. So this is the address of the founder. And I'm transferring from the founder to the recipient. So let me just pick up another address. I'm just going to be doubly sure. So let me pick up this as the recipient. All right, so my bad there. The recipient has to be the one that I've just allowed. So this was the this particular address. So I'll just copy this one. So 0xab8. This should be the recipient. I picked up the wrong recipient, and now transactions should work successfully. So I'll just take a quick recap for you to clarify this. So I'm going to remove this as it will cause a bit of confusion while I was testing. So I'll copy this over here and I'll paste this over here. So this is the recipient, and to this recipient I am now transacting 50 tokens. All right, and I will now put the address of the founder, which is already there. All right, so let's just take a quick recap. So in the transfer from function, what we did was that we selected the address of the founder, and then what we did was that we went to the transfer from function, and inside the transfer from function we put the actual address of the founder, and the recipient is the one who was given allowance earlier. So if you remember, in the approve function we had given this address 0xab8 and approval for 50 tokens. So we essentially signed the check, which is the approve function, signing the check of 50 tokens, and we had hit transact. And then we went on into the allowance function, and when I paste the same address of this recipient inside the allowance function, I would get 50 tokens. So I went into the allowance function and I checked that how much has this owner, which is the founder, allowed this particular address tokens. So if I hit call, it basically shows me there were 50. So so step 1, approve, step 2, allowance, and step 3, transfer. So step 1, approve. So this is where the actual approval of 50 tokens happened. Step 2, allowance. This is where we check. So it's optional. If you don't want to check, then you don't check. But yeah, this essentially gives you the checking capability, that who allowed who to spend how much or withdraw how much. And the transfer from function is where you're actually transferring it from the owner to the new recipient. And you can transfer anything 50 or under 50, but if you go over 50, that's where it should give you an error, because it is not in the allowed list. All right, so I would strongly suggest that you practice all of these things a couple of times, and practice it with different amounts. Keep a note, like I was doing initially when I was giving you the tasks, and then I started going in a bit of speed. And that was on purpose to make sure that you understand and start processing that in your mind. But a good practice is that put all your tasks in your Solidity code and see who is transacting to whom, so that you have a record, because otherwise you'll forget. And then do some operations using these methods to talk to the smart contract, and create some couple of scenarios, pass some tokens from one user to the other, allow somebody and disallow, and move on from there. So do a bit of this practice before you go on further lessons. So I hope ERC20 token, creation of ERC20 token, and playing with these functions and variables, the getter functions, I hope this made good sense. And with all of that and more in our next series. So thank you for watching, and hope you had fun.